Guys, the 12th Anniversary Terran Bundle is finally here, so that means I gotta start figuring out what I'm gonna do with all these ships. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking about which ship am I going to do first. It was a really difficult decision because, I'm kidding, obviously I'm going to do Lexington first. It's a miracle worker Yorktown with a spinal lance and a hat. I've never been so eager to get my hands on a ship. Here she is, the Lexington Dreadnought cruiser. Can we take a moment to appreciate just how fantastic this ship looks? The Yorktown refit of the Odyssey was already a gorgeous ship, and was made even more so with its recent revamp. But now on top of that, this Lexington version adds a spinal lance cannon and this cool sensor pod. I'll admit when I first saw it, I wasn't that into the sensor pod, but the look has grown on me very quickly. It probably has something to do with the fact that people on Twitter keep telling me that it's the Odyssey's top hat, which is a bit I am more than happy to play along with. The biggest difference between the Lexington and previous iterations of the Odyssey are that this ship is a miracle worker, whereas the others have always had command seating. That means that this ship is much better suited to energy weapon builds, which is why I've put a beam overload build on this. Because this ship has a spinal lance, I really wanted to do a forward-facing build, so that means using dual beam banks and omni beams. But the biggest downside to this ship is that it has a 4-4 weapons layout. Fortunately, the fact that this is a miracle worker ship does kind of make up for that. With Miracle Worker, I'll have access to mixed armament synergy, so adding a turret in the back isn't actually a bad thing, because it's one more weapon to trigger that damage buff, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In the forward weapon slots, first is the Terran Task Force Phaser Dual Heavy Cannon. Remember what I said about mixed armament synergy? Mixing in a cannon with my beams will actually help with that damage buff. Also, because I'm using preferential targeting, I have scatter volley on this build, so this cannon is actually getting even more of a buff. This extra bit of AoE damage can actually be really helpful on a single target build like this. This cannon comes from the Terran Task Force reputation. Next is an Agony Phaser Dual Beam Bank. I only have the one because that's all I have the room for. This is here just because I like the proc for Agony Beams. They deal some extra damage over time, and have a chance to disable targets. These come from the Infinity lockboxes and can also be found on the exchange. Next is the Dual Beam Bank Phaser from the Discovery reputation. This is a pretty powerful weapon, but it's mostly here for its set bonuses. Along with the Dark Matter Quantum Torpedo and Lorca's Custom Fire Control, both of which are also rather powerful in their own right, you gain a stacking crit severity buff with the 2-piece, and the ability to launch an extra torpedo with the 3-piece. Next is the Protomatter Deflector from the Colony Fleet Holding for its crit chance and crit severity buff, the Competitive Reputation Impulse Engine for its speed buffs. Now, usually I use a deuterium stabilized warp core, but I've been leaning back toward the Spire warp cores lately. The stabilized cores have another 5% weapons power cost reduction, but this core also has a huge buff to power transfer rate and a small damage buff from the Amp mod. Honestly, it's probably not going to make a significant difference either way, but this core is much easier to obtain because it's fleet gear. The deuterium stabilized core is a random drop, so getting one with good mods on it is kind of a pain in the butt. And of course for the shield is Tilly's Review Pending Modified Shield from the Discovery reputation, because of the shield damage buff it gives to your weapons. Now in the aft weapons, what I've done is probably not as surprising as you might think. These first two weapons are the Trilithium Omnibeam and Turret, both of which are rewards from the episode Beyond the Nexus. Both of these have a proc to increase your firing cycle haste by 10%. Now that proc won't stack, but by having both of these weapons on the same build, you get 2 separate chances to trigger it, so it's still pretty valuable to have both. Plus, like I said earlier, it's good to mix the turret in with the beams because of mixed armament synergy. Though honestly, you could still do that even without mixed armament. Next is an Agony Omni Phaser Beam. Like the Dual Beam Bank, these come from the lockboxes or the exchange. And lastly is the Kinetic Cutting Beam from the Omega Task Force reputation. While this does have a 360-degree firing arc, the Cutting Beam is not considered an Omni Beam. For one, it doesn't deal a typical energy weapon damage type. It actually deals kinetic damage, hence the name. It's also not affected by firing mode abilities, so Beam Overload or Fire Will aren't going to do anything to it. And that's why I'm able to equip this with the other 2 Omni Beams, because it's technically not an Omni Beam. In the devices are my usual assortment for energy weapons. Energy amplifiers for the bonus damage to my beams, Deuterium Surplus for the speed boost, Reactive Armor Catalyst in case I need a heal, Kobayashi Maru Transponder for the random buffs, and Red Matter Capacitor for the buff to my power levels. In the consoles, first is Lorca's Custom Fire Control from the Discovery reputation. This is here for its buffs to crit chance, weapons power setting, and shield penetration, and for its set bonuses, which I already discussed. In the other universal slot, I have Immolating Phaser Lance off of the Deimos Pilot Escort. This gives a passive buff to phaser damage and shield penetration, and its click is a lance attack that deals heavy phaser damage, which can stack up to 6 charges, meaning it can be fired off pretty rapidly. I really wanted to include this console on the ship because it literally has a lance on the model, so it really felt thematically appropriate. Also because it does a lot of damage. Next is the famous DPRM off the Atlas Prototype Dreadnought, and it's here because of its click ability's massive buff to bonus damage. Next to it is the Domino from the Bajoran Interceptor, which is here for its buff to bonus damage and firing cycle haste. Firing cycle haste is a very important stat on a beam overload build, so you want to be able to buff it as much as you possibly can. That's also why I'm using these next 2 consoles. Temporal Trajectory Shifter off the Narendra, which basically allows you to steal weapons haste from your enemy target. You'll be lowering theirs while increasing your own. This is something you'll want to trigger on large boss enemies like tactical cubes. Next is the Flagship Tactical Computer off of the Yorktown Star Cruiser, also its Klingon and Romulan versions and the legendary versions. I'm actually really glad to have this console because it gives a nice amount of haste, but I hardly ever get to use it on energy weapon builds because they're bound to the flagships. So that's variants of the Odyssey, Bortosk, or Scimitar. So it's nice to finally be able to use this on a ship that's actually well suited to energy weapon builds, because the rest of them all have command seating. Same thing with this next console, Adaptive Energy Systems. This one comes off of the Sojourner Star Cruiser. And again, the Klingon and Romulan versions and the legendary versions. And again, this one is also only bound to the flagships, though this one deals bonus damage instead of haste. It also has a set bonus with the previous console. Having the 2Bs gives me a little bit more crit chance, and a small buff to my turn rate, which is actually pretty helpful on a ship this large. Next are my usual low-buy-store consoles. The Tachyokinetic Converter for the crit chance and crit severity buff, also the turn rate buff is kind of helpful here, and Bioneural Infusion Circuits for its massive crit severity buff. In the tactical consoles are just a bunch of vulnerability locators from the Fleet Spire. These are here to buff my phaser damage and my crit chance. And in the hangar bay are the Elite Alliance Fighter Squadrons, which can be unlocked with the new Jarok Alliance Carrier. I'm using these because their focused assault will give me and the rest of the team a nice amount of bonus damage, and because they don't have a torpedo so they're not going to steal anyone's concentrate firepower. Though if you missed out on the Jarok, the Mirror Universe shuttlecraft this ship comes with are also really good substitutes. For my specializations, this should be no surprise at this point. I'm using Intelligence Officer to gain access to space flanking, which will give me some extra damage when firing on an enemy's rear arc, and Temporal Operative as my secondary for Entropic Rider, which will give some extra physical damage to my weapons fire. In the personal traits, first we have Adaptive Offense for the crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back, Context is for Kings for the bonus damage buff, Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage buff based on my team size, Fragment of AI Tech for the energy weapon damage buff based on my control expertise, Innocuous for the crit severity buff and the reduction to my threat generation, Inspirational Leader for the chance to buff all of my starship skills, Intel Agent Attaché to lower the cooldown of my captain's abilities, Superior Beam Training for the bonus damage buff to my beams, Terran Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff, Unconventional Systems to lower the cooldowns of my universal consoles, and the Boimler Effect to help with the cooldown of my bridge officer abilities. In the starship traits, first is Emergency Weapon Cycle from the Arbiter. This is here to buff my firing cycle haste and reduce my weapons power cost every time I use emergency power to weapons. Overpowered and Overgunned is here because it does pretty much the same thing, except it's triggered off of your firing modes. Next is Preferential Targeting off of the Tier 6 NX refit and its legendary version. Anytime I use Scatter Volley, it'll give a sizable buff to Beam Overload. This is another reason why it's not a bad idea to mix in a couple cannons with this Beam Overload build. I've already got Scatter Volley, I may as well get a little bit more use out of it. Super Weapon Ingenuity comes off of the Xindi Adalith Dreadnought, which is a low-buy-store ship, and it's here because it increases the duration of my Beam Overload by 5 seconds. Meaning, with proper cooldown reduction, I should be able to keep this active pretty much 100% of the time. Universal Designs off the Crossfield refit was supposed to be slotted here. Apparently I had Terran Goodbye in there, which is not what I wanted. Anyway, what this trait does is every time I activate a Universal console, I gain a stacking buff to crit chance and crit severity. This trait pairs really well with the Immolating Phaser Lance because of how quickly that console can be fired off. So with that, you'll actually be able to build and maintain those stacks rather easily. And the last trait is Calm Before the Storm off the Cardassian Gamorre Intel Flight Deck Carrier. This one was actually a suggestion from Augie. This will give a 33% firing cycle haste for 20 seconds. However, it takes 20 seconds in combat to build up. So you're not going to see that haste buff right away, but like I said, haste is very important for a Beam Overload build, so at least you'll be getting that eventually. And the fact that it stays up for 20 seconds, that's actually not bad. In the Space Reputation traits is my usual assortment for energy weapon builds. Advanced Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff, Tyler's Duality for the crit chance buff based on my hull capacity, Precision for more crit chance, Magnified Firepower for the bonus damage to my weapons, and Controlled Countermeasures for the bonus weapon damage against controlled targets. In the Bridge Officer stations, first is a Lieutenant Commander Universal, which I am using for science. Jam Targeting Sensors and Scramble Sensors are both here for unconventional systems triggers. Gravity Well is also an unconventional systems trigger, but is also useful for gaining some control over your enemies. In the tactical seat, first is Torpedo Spread to buff my torpedo, Scatter Volley to trigger preferential targeting and to buff my cannons, and Beam Overload 3 to buff my beams. In the Lieutenant Tactical/Intel seat, first I have Viral Impulse Burst, which is also an unconventional systems trigger, and then Attack Pattern Beta for the debuff. Though, thinking on it now, I might have been better off with Electromagnetic Pulse Probe, which is also an unconventional systems trigger, meaning I would be able to lower the cooldowns on my universal consoles that much more quickly. In the Engineering/Miracle Worker seat, first I have Emergency Power to Weapons 1 to trigger Emergency Weapon Cycle, Emit Unstable Warp Bubble for the unconventional systems trigger, Narrow Sensor Bands, which gives my energy weapons a bonus damage buff that scales based on the distance to my targets, and mixed armament synergy. When I fire a weapon while this is activated, it'll buff any other weapon types on my build. So if I fire a beam while this is active, it'll give a bonus damage buff to my cannons and torpedoes. And in the Ensign Science seat is Tractor Beam for, again, another unconventional systems trigger. In the duty officers, first is 24 of 47. Activating a tactical ability gives me a chance to buff my power levels, and activating a miracle worker ability gives me a chance to buff my crit chance. Next is 27 of 47. Activating a tactical ability gives me a chance to buff my crit severity, and a chance to buff my crit chance with intel. Then a couple of projectile duty officers to buff my crit chance and severity, an energy weapon officer to buff my shield penetration every time I use beam overload, and 39 of 47 to help the cooldowns of my tactical and miracle worker bridge officer abilities. Normally I use this for the additional notes, but I don't really have anything else to say on this ship. I like it, that's about it. I wish I had a 5-3 weapons layout, but I still like it. Anyway, let's move on to the ISE and then the Parse. $321k on a beam overload build on a 4-4 weapons layout. Honestly, that's pretty respectable, especially when you also take into account that Augie was stealing all the DPS with that broken adamant console. I swear, every time I do one of these with Augie, he's always got to bring the most overpowered crap. Which I realize how that sounds, but it's kind of legit this time. That console is broken, Augie, don't get attached to it, because it's going to get nerfed. Augie aside, I was also having quite a few connection issues. You may have noticed all the lag. I think it was a combination of the servers being really crowded because it's the first day of the event campaign, and we're having some pretty crappy weather here where I am right now, and I think that might be screwing with my internet connection. But even with Augie and the technical issues I was having, I still managed to do over 300k, which in my opinion is pretty impressive. So yeah, that is my beam overload build on the Lexington Dreadnought. I hope it helps you in making your own. Now, the next few videos are probably going to be focused around this new bundle because, you know, new content. Though right now my issue is I don't really know which ship I want to do next. Part of me wants to do the Adamant next, but that would probably just end up being really similar to my Cannon Defiant build. The Trailblazer I'd probably do a torpedo build on, but I know how much you guys really don't like it when I do torpedo builds. And the Cygnus probably would just be another beam overload build, so it wouldn't be that different from this build. I could also very easily keep going with this ship. I actually already have another build lined up for it. It's a turret build. Anyway, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. I know you've heard it all before, but it does help the channel and I do appreciate it. My name's Stu, and I'll see you guys next time.